All right. There we are. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first UJUG event of 2022. We're glad you made it, whether you're watching now live or you're catching the recording of this later. We've got a really exciting talk for you today from Matt Raible. He's been with us a couple times before. But this one's going to be special because we're doing the interview AMA style again. So really looking forward to some interesting questions from the audience. We've got a number of questions that the UJUG board's put together. We think should be really interesting and hope everybody enjoys it. Before we get into the talk, though, you have a couple quick housekeeping notes to mention. The first is just as we welcome you to the new year, just a reminder, we've got two other talks lined up for this quarter. So in February, we've got Venkat, his talk on the don'ts of functional plus latest trends. That's going to be another interview style. And then in March, we've got Chris Mackey coming back. He's going to talk about cloud architecture and the latest trends. And that'll be another interview in AMA style. We've seen this has been very popular, and we really like the sort of nuanced conversation we get out of these. So do make sure to attend those if you can. Same time, it'll be the 17th of each month. Also, a quick reminder at the end, please stick around. We do have some door prizes to give out, some free licenses, and a couple other things. So you'll want to be here for that. And finally, before we get started, we have one of our sponsors here. We got Madeline Thatcher from Goldman Sachs. It's one of our oldest sponsors, and she's going to give a few words before we dive in. Madeline, hi.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Madeline. I work as the Chief of Staff for Engineering at Goldman Sachs in Salt Lake City, Utah. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes and introduce Goldman Sachs to those of you who may be unfamiliar. Obviously, Goldman Sachs is a financial institution, one of the largest investment banks in the world, but we also have a very strong engineering presence. For our people worldwide, which is a little bit over 40,000, a little over a third of our people are engineers. In Salt Lake City, we are the second largest office in the Americas and the fourth largest in the world, making us a pretty important part of the Goldman Sachs ecosystem. And we are always looking for talented engineers to join our teams. We are currently hiring for all levels of Java engineers. That's analyst, associate, or our vice president level. And while we look for experience with Java, all of our teams use Java. Many teams will also use similar languages. So if you have experience in things like C++, C#, Scala, Python, or any other coding languages, we are very interested in seeing if you'd be a good fit for us. At Goldman, we are really looking to build strong and efficient software development lifecycle practices. And we are looking for people who have a really great systematic problem-solving approach to the issues that get put in front of us. For preferred qualifications, we're looking for people who have scripting experience, who are interested in big data technology stack, any sort of Unix environment working experience, things like that. I should note that although we are a financial institution, having financial experience is not necessary. We will teach you what you need to know in regards to the financial aspect of any roles that we have open. But if you are, good at Java, good at the coding, wanting to kind of put those skills to use, we'd love to see if there's a good fit for you. All of our teams work on, they work on a variety of different projects. That's, buying and selling financial products, raising funding, helping manage risk. It's a really exciting place to work. And I know that there are a lot of assumptions about work environment at Goldman, a lot of it well-deserved. But I will say that engineering is very different from other aspects of the firm. So you're working a normal number of hours, about 40 hours a week. Right now, we're in a very flexible hybrid work from home option right now. And we foresee that continuing through the remaining of the year. So we would love to have you apply. Our website is goldmansachs.com/careers. And I'll also put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions or want to reach out to me in particular, I'm happy to connect you with the people who are looking for people with your experience to join their team. So thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be sponsoring you guys.
Thanks, Madeline. And thanks again for the contributions from Goldman Sachs. We appreciate you helping keep this running.
Yeah, of course.
All right. So before we dive into our main speaker here, a quick introduction. So if you don't know who Matt Raible is, he's been pretty well known in the Java community for a while, been building web applications for most of his adult life. Over 20 years development experience. He's a Java champion, developer advocate for Okta, contributes to open source. He's a fan of Java, IntelliJ, TypeScript, Angular, and Spring Boot. He's, in his own words, he's also well, this might be Don's words, but he's a member of the Badass J Hipster development team and loves classic VW. So I mentioned that one particularly because this is an AMA, so everything's fair game. And on that note, let's have Matt come on board. Matt, welcome to UJug.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you again. Quick reminder to the audience here. So we have some questions lined up, but we really want participation from everybody. So if you've got questions, whether they're focused on something specific to Matt's career or something that he just might have a strong opinion on, add it at the bottom. Make sure to submit it, and we'll get it asked on live camera. So before we begin, though, do you have any thoughts, anything that you want to bring to us that's been on top of your mind that you're just itching, dying to get off your chest and tell the world about?
I'll tell a story about one of my trips out to UJug. It was an event where I spoke the night before at the Denver Jug, and then I had to be at the UJug the next night. And months beforehand, I had planned that I would actually drive there. And when the opportunity came to drive there, it was in the middle of several snowstorms. And so I actually, instead of driving my Volkswagen van, I had to borrow my wife's hybrid Tahoe. And that was, I don't think I've told many people about it, but one of the scariest driving days of my life. It took about 8 hours to get there. I ended up showing up 15 minutes before my talk, so good timing. But at one point on the Wyoming freeway, I-80 there, my windshield wiper went flying off, totally lost it, right? And it was the kind of situation where you needed windshield wipers, right? Because it's blowing snow. I think it was 3 or 4 snowstorms that I drove through that day. And because I was estimating how long it would take me there, I had Google Maps up and everything like that, and I only had 20 minutes to spare. I actually pulled off the road, swapped the windshield wipers, and kept driving, with the one on the passenger side just screeching, on the window itself. And obviously, my wife wasn't very happy about that because it left a mark in that passenger side for the duration of the time we had that vehicle. But I did make it on time, and it turned out to be one of the best powder days I've ever had in Utah the next day. So all worth it.
Very pragmatic solution to a problem, just like an engineer, right?
Right.
Oh, excellent. Well, since we just had a recruitment message, I thought it might be good to kick things off here with a thought that we heard from several recruiters recently and get your thoughts on it. So it seems that React jobs have gotten really hot lately. And we know, there's a wide community of front-end development from Angular, React, and Vue, and some others. But we're curious if you're seeing this trend with React as well. And if so, do you have any thoughts on what's kind of driving it?
Well, so I see the trend from a numbers perspective. If you're comparing GitHub stars or Stack Overflow tagged questions, and even jobs themselves, right? I use Indeed as a reference for a lot of my talks when I talk about jobs for a particular framework, and I have seen that level, 2 to 3x above other frameworks. And I think a lot of it is because if you think about React, and I actually learned this from Venkat, even though I'd done React for a couple of years, I sat in one of his talks and I was like, that's so true. And it was that React can actually be just part of the application, right? You can have a React component, you can, import the JavaScript for it. You don't need to build the whole application with React, and you can just have a part of the app using React. And Vue's kind of similar, but I think React is more popular, and it's really replacing jQuery in that sense, right? People would use jQuery for that kind of, enhanced behavior on a particular page, versus Angular is you got to do the whole app, in Angular. So I think that's part of the reason. It's also, how things work once they get popular and they keep getting popular, there's no stopping it, right? And the React community is one of the few that has never had a backwards compatibility problem. So when Angular 2 came out, they alienated a lot of their users, especially because they said, we're going to rewrite everything. It's going to be totally different, and we'll be back in a year, right? And so people had to get work done. So they went and wrote, I think, React apps instead. And then the experience was so good and so nice that they were like, I'm just going to stay here, right? And so I think that's a big reason for that.
Interesting, yeah. So I guess that mindset of kind of picking and choosing your frameworks, I've heard it referred to as a microfrontends in some circles. So you see that popping up more and more frequently?
Well, I do see microfrontends as a concept, mostly because I think, in JHipster, we do it as a monolith UI. So if you generate a, microservices architecture, let's say you have 10 different microservices, still the UI for that, if you do have a UI and you generate with JHipster, doesn't matter which framework you use, it will have a monolith UI, which is kind of an anti-pattern, right? I mean, if you have microservices that you want to deploy independently and then you have to deploy this monolith of a UI, whenever you deploy a microservice, that kind of doesn't make sense. So the micro front end concept like solves that really well. I think it's similar though to microservices in the sense that a lot of shops that are doing microservices typically choose like one or two languages or frameworks, right? Spring Boot is very popular for that. And maybe there'll be a Node app or whatever that does some processing, but you typically don't get, Micronaut, Quarkus, and Spring Boot in the same microservices architecture just because developers wanted to use it, right? So I think micro front ends is a similar sense where you could do like Vue and React and Angular in the same architecture, but should you? Right? Like that knowledge gained from learning one framework is probably better spread, through everyone instead of like everyone chooses their own and tries to make it work with micro front ends.
Yeah. I'm really curious if anyone in the audience has similar experiences around that, or if they've fallen on one camp or the other. So if anyone listening, if any of these resonates, do comment in the chat. Even if you don't have a direct question, Matt can see the chat; he can engage with it as well. You also mentioned something interesting about like the whole Angular fallout after the non-backwards compatibility. I've noticed not quite a similar trend, but there's something interesting about React. It seems to be moving more and more to a functional style programming. Which can be polarizing in some areas. Have you seen that affect its uptake or any of the development around that community?
For me, it was one of those things where I didn't know a whole lot more than, reading a few tutorials, and maybe I'd spent, less than 10 hours like learning it. And then I went off and tried to develop my own app with it, with the great Google engine and Stack Overflow and stuff. And what I found myself doing was actually like creating components and copying and pasting them, and it just worked. So for me, that was a new thing that I hadn't really experienced with Angular as much, right? You had to create a component, and then maybe you had a pipe, or maybe you had something else. But React, it was like, this makes sense to extract this out, put it over here in this component, and then reuse it in these two components. And it was just intuitive in that sense. So I don't know if that's, reactive so much as intuitiveness.
Absolutely.
That's what I've seen a lot.
Fascinating. So we talked a little bit about the three kind of major frameworks out there, but are there any other frameworks, either new or newer versions, that you're keeping an eye on or starting to pique your interest at all?
I do think it's interesting just commenting on the popularity of them before I get into the other frameworks that are available. As I do think that that Twitter is not a great like representation of popularity, because it doesn't really include all the developers, right? And even LinkedIn's the same way. I think a lot of people, I used to work at LinkedIn back in the day, and someone gave me a script early on that I could remove all notifications that they would ever send me. So I've never received an email from LinkedIn in the last 10 years, and I still use it a lot. But that's why people hate LinkedIn, right? They're like, the emails are terrible. And so I have a different experience than most people, but I do think that those aren't a great representation of the broader community. Even Reddit or Stack Overflow isn't, right? And so what I've seen in my experience at Okta is that the enterprises, right, the ones that like Java application servers were targeting way back in the day, those ones are the ones that are kind of using like Angular a lot. And Google has like thousands of Angular apps, right? And so React is it's making inroads into like the enterprise, but it's still more popular among like startups and people that want to move fast, kind of like Ruby on Rails, right? You can get things up and running quickly, and then once you grow up, maybe you need to rewrite it. But I don't think you need to rewrite React. But that's where Angular still has a strong foothold, and I don't see that like changing. But it's probably never going to be reflected in the numbers as much as the other ones that are more popular with the general community, And then as far as like up and coming frameworks, probably the two that are most like on my radar is Tailwind for CSS, because we have Bootstrap, right, and Angular Material. So those are some popular like CSS frameworks. And then Svelte is one that people seem to like a lot, as far as gives you building blocks to build up. And I haven't played with it that much, but there is a guy on the JHipster team that created a Svelte blueprint for JHipster, so you can use that as an alternative. And that's why I kind of mention it as an up and comer, is because someone believes in it enough to spend a bunch of time creating that. And then there's always the mobile frameworks for doing web, right? Like Ionic and React Native, and those continue to seem to be more popular than ever.
Right, right. I've also seen some of those show up on the desktop side as well, right? With like Electron and similar frameworks like that.
Oh yeah, and it's funny. Like everyone loves to bash on Electron, right? And they're like, "Ah, Slack sucks," but they never complain about VS Code, and that was written in Electron, right? So there's certain things that work well and certain things that don't. But I think it's proven itself that it works pretty good for a cross-platform way of doing things if you don't want to invest in each platform, right? And so you'll see some companies. I think Slack just had something this week where they were like, "We rewrote our Mac client in Swift." Right. And so they actually ditched like Electron. And then you have others that are like, we rewrote ours in Electron, right? So it kind of goes back and forth. And I think a lot of times it's just people, right? Can you hire the people that know how to do it? And do you have people that are enthusiastic about working with, X framework or X language?
Yeah, what sounds like too, you're also echoing a lot of what like Venkat's opinion too, which is for a lot of people, it doesn't seem to be so much of an ideological choice as much as what fits the needs of the use case, right?
Right. And a lot of times we as developers don't get to choose the frameworks, right? Like we wish we could, but that's also a lot of responsibility, right? If you step up on a team of 10 and say, we should use React and no one else knows it, now you're the one that's like responsible for teaching everyone React and, investing in it maybe in your later hours and stuff like that. So I think that can be intimidating for people too, even though they like a different framework than what they're currently using. They're like, I don't know that I'm an expert on it, right? I don't know that I could
Absolutely.
be the architect for this, so that can be tough too.
Yeah, great point. The sort of the one piece of technology that again and again is touted as maybe changing the game here a little bit is WebAssembly, right? Which promises to sort of cut down that barrier and say you could bring anything you want in. There's been a lot of information coming out of the years. Doesn't seem to be picking up a ton of traction quite yet, but I'm really curious what your latest thoughts on it are and where it's going, where it's been, and kind of what the future of it is.
So let me preface it by saying I haven't written a WebAssembly app, so I'm no expert, right? It's just kind of a guy who's been in this field for a while, and what I think from a lot of the talks that I've seen on it, it's not a replacement for JavaScript. It's kind of it's a replacement for doing like the heavy lifting that a web app might do normally in the background. It's if you think of service workers for PWAs, right? That was almost a way of spawning off another thread or doing things on a background thread. And I think WebAssembly is similar in that it can do your heavy processing, but I don't know that anyone would rewrite a whole app that's in JavaScript in a browser in WebAssembly. They might just take parts of it. And I don't think it's meant to do that, right? It's not meant to replace JavaScript in the browser. And the reason JavaScript in the browser is so popular is because it's pretty easy, right? Like as a developer, a savvy developer, you can probably pick it up in an hour or two. And a lot of the people that hate it, used it way back before jQuery, and they were tired of the document.write and, worrying about all the different browsers and stuff like that. So I think it kind of gets a bad rap. But the funny thing too is that it's seen as like a young and hip language, even though it and Java were invented in the same year, right? And so
Yeah. How strange is that to see it? Well, everything happens in cycles, so it's fresh again, right?
Right. And there is a use case for WebAssembly that I have seen recently that I think might really propel it a lot. And that is that you can distribute code that can't be reverse engineered, right? That runs in the browser. And so, that's the biggest problem with JavaScript. There's all this obfuscation and stuff that people do, but they're always like worried, what if someone steals the code and, then can do exactly what we do here? And I think that WebAssembly kind of gives you that option of saying, hey, for the, our IP and stuff like that, let's just do that in a different, code base, but still running in the browser.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so that might end up being de facto just for those reasons alone, even if it's not your primary use case, right?
Yeah, and I think we're still waiting for, like, I'm a frameworks aficionado, right? I've always loved frameworks. I've always enjoyed like dabbling in them and stuff. And a lot of the reason is I'm just not that smart, right? I can't write my own framework, so I prefer to use other people's. And then if any architect or anything blames me, I can just point at the framework, right? But I think
plausible deniability.
Right? Like WebAssembly doesn't have that, right? Like most languages or frameworks, or most languages have like a framework that really boosted them, and they became real popular because of it. Like, unfortunately, Java was struts, right? Back in 2001, that's when it really like, holy cow, I need to learn struts, right? A lot of Java developers thought that. And so I think there's probably something coming for WebAssembly that's like a framework or some sort of APIs that people go, oh, wow, that's so easy. I'm just going to do WebAssembly now instead of JavaScript,
Right, right. This might be a good time to pull an audience question here. This is right up that alley. Ian Robertson asked, if you had to pick a front-end JS framework to use for your next project, without knowing what the project was, that's the caveat, what would you pick? Or another way to frame it is, what would your current default choice be?
I'm biased because I just published a book on Angular. But, that's what I got to go with because, I know it best and I've used it the longest. But, Vue and React would certainly be like up there. And I think a lot of it would be the team I'm working with. Like if I'm just solo, which, rarely happens unless you start your own thing and just no one cares what you're using then, you really do have to take into consideration like other people's experiences and what they know. But I don't think there's really much danger in choosing any of them because there's so much community knowledge out there, right? That the Googleability of it is pretty high. And that's what I see with a lot of the newer frameworks is if it just came out and you're trying to do something that you did in Angular, like it's really tough to figure it out because no one's done it before. Whereas like Angular JS was similar to jQuery. It really blew up with its ecosystem and all the different plugins that people created, right? And that's why Angular 2 was such a hit on the project because all of those plugins had to be rewritten or all those extensions that people were writing. And so, there's a lot of knowledge out there for all of them. And I think you could be successful with all of them. Like what I try to say is like, it's choosing between a Bugatti and a Ferrari and a Lamborghini. Like it's really similar, right? And it's just a matter of taste, like which ones work better for you.
Okay. All right. That's some really great thoughts there. Kind of switching gears a little bit. For anyone else who has more thoughts on this, you get a question that comes to you late and you really wish you'd asked it, still throw it in there. We can always go back and talk more about these. But just kind of going to get a little round sampling of your thoughts. On the security side of things, are there any dev security patterns that you think should be standard that currently aren't?
Well, if you asked me 5 years ago, I'd probably have a different opinion than I have today because I've been working at Okta, right?
Yeah.
And even though I got into like writing, integration for like Java EE with app views like back in the early 2000s, right? I've always had an interest in it, but I've really learned like a lot of patterns and things that you shouldn't do, right? By working at Okta. And so one of the probably biggest misconceptions is like you should be doing authentication in your SPA. Right. And so if you have Angular, React, or Vue or whatever, and you have a backend, right? So you have Node or you have Java or you have .NET, doesn't really matter. People like to separate those, and then they like to do their authentication on the front end and like store their tokens or whatever things they're using to keep that, communication going, and then send those to the back end and keep it stateless. And the reason they want to keep it stateless is so it can scale.
Mm-hmm.
But they've never had a scalability problem. They just think that stateless will be more scalable, right? And so, like, that's the pattern that even I, when I started Okta, like, believed in. And what I've come to realize is if you can do the authentication on the back end and, use good old cookies, right, to communicate with your front end, like, that's the most secure way of doing things. And so it kind of took me a while to realize that. And you know what? If you go to, like, most of the FANGs, they're still using, like, session cookies because it's been around for 20 years. Most frameworks understand it. It's really secure for the most part versus like storing access tokens and things that can get, compromised on the client. So sometimes you'll be developing a client that doesn't have a backend that you can integrate with. So in that case, use those, access tokens and do the authentication on the front end. Try to use OpenID Connect. The reason I recommend that is mostly because it prevents your users from sharing their data with you in your app. And so it's kind of it's an anti-pattern, but I developed like this for years. And that is that you create an app and you have the users in that app, right? Maybe in that database for the app, and everything works because everything's self-contained. Well, when you get into an enterprise situation, you have 100 apps. You don't want to have user management for each one of those. You probably have a central system that you want to use. So that's where the OpenID Connect and the OAuth kind of provides that pattern. Now, what would be interesting is if, I'm no longer working for Okta, do I still believe that? And I think so. I hope so, right? Because, the whole notion of OAuth and why it came about as delegated authorization was because, people used to type in their Gmail username and password into LinkedIn or into Yelp, right? And then Yelp and LinkedIn would go out and invite all your contacts to like join the service. Right. And there was no guarantee that they didn't keep that. right? They probably said like, we don't store your password, but there's no guarantee. And so, that's the whole reason for OAuth is go to someone else, authenticate there, and then get some tokens back that give you access to your data, or give that app access to your data.
Yeah, yeah. So you use some words there. I have to ask the question. There's a very controversial technology around tokens, the JWT token, JWT.
Yep.
If you're familiar with Hacker News, I'm sure you've seen on a yearly basis. There's several threads that get started. Don't be shy. What are your opinions on JWT?
It's fucking terrible.
Like
the biggest,
sorry, go ahead.
The biggest problem is, as a spec, it says that you can have an algorithm of none, right? So you can have, they're signing tokens and sending them across the wire, but if there's no algorithm to sign it, then it's not really, secure. And so that's one of the biggest problems, is a spec problem, where they allow all these things. So if people want to be spec compliant, then they have to implement them all. And there's a great site out there. I forget the URL, but you can Google. It's like, how many days since the last alg none for JWT, like, thing that people got hacked for, right? And so there's a better standard out there called Paceto that actually takes all the bad parts out of JWT. And there's tokens that you can use. You can even have private tokens, and it kind of solves a lot of JWT's problems. But from an OAuth perspective, like, OAuth never said that the access token had to be a JWT. It just says it has to be a random string of characters. And so guess what a JWT is if it's unparsed? It's a random string of characters, right? So you could still use JWTs that way. You don't have to parse them. You don't have to, validate them and all that kind of stuff. You can, send them as what they call an opaque token to your authorization server and have the validation done there. Because a lot of times what happens with JWTs, people that are processing them or validating them are doing it wrong, or there's that algorithm of none in there. And then what people try to do, because they're doing stateless architectures to be more scalable, is they put all that information in the JWT, right? And so generating the JWT, like putting all that information in, processing it, actually adds like more processing, power that you need in your app and on your clients to like do that stuff, versus session cookies have worked great for 20 years. Yeah.
Very, very fair points. What was the name of that technology that you mentioned, which is a fair replacement for JWT?
Paceto, Paseto.
Okay, something I would check out for anyone who hasn't seen that yet. That weight that you mentioned, or that overhead, also can play a fact in responsiveness, depending on how you have your system set up. One area we were curious about was if you had any responsiveness design tips, whether it be web or mobile related.
A lot of the mobile response stuff I've seen is they talk about mobile first development, and that's actually not using these giant 38-inch monitors and these wicked fast MacBook Pros, right? It's using a shitty old Android device, and it's using that as your main testing device, right? Like, you run code, you look at it, see how it looks there, and then you actually expand it out so it looks good on a desktop if you want to do the responsive design that way. So I think, that's something that probably people don't realize as much. I like it because you can talk to product managers and be like, hey, we need the features to fit on the screen, right? And so you can get away with a smaller MVP, because if you have a desktop screen, like, a lot of times they're designing to fit every little widget they can on that desktop, and then they scale it down, and you're just hiding stuff, right? You're hiding functionality, but you're still sending that same payload to the client, and that can be, something you just don't need. I think another thing you can do is there is tools out there. I haven't used them, but a lot of times with the CSS frameworks, like, we might have a lot of CSS that isn't used, right, on the client. And so I think there's ways to really optimize that to just what's being used. And then you can really get your payload, a lot smaller. If you're doing like PWAs, if you're doing, an app that is a mobile app that's written with Ionic, for instance, that sits on a device, then a lot of those concerns aren't there, because you're not loading those over the network, right? You're just loading them locally. Right. But if you have a progressive web app that you're serving to, everyone around the world, like, that shaving off a few $100K in unused CSS can make a big difference.
Yeah, great points. While you're discussing that, we had a couple question follow-ups for on the subject of these tokens. In particular, the first one here is from Kalyani asking, what do you think of, I don't know if I'm saying this properly, Vadin or Vadin?
Vaadin.
Vadin. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
So Vaadin's a way that once started as like a way of writing Java code and generating JavaScript, and then I believe they adopted GWT for the most part, and they kind of became the leaders of that for a while because Google was like, we don't really want to do this anymore. We kind of want the Angular thing, and now I think they're actually doing a different component model where you could still write Java and generate JavaScript, but I've also seen them evangelize a lot of writing JavaScript to talk to your Java backend, and so I think it's great. I mean, I don't have any problems with the framework itself. I think, I started out as a UI developer before a Java developer, so I still like writing with the frameworks like Angular and React, and I'm not so tied to Java like many people that use Vaadin or GWT are, right? They're like, I just love Java, and I just want to generate my front end with it. I don't want to mess with React. And so I think that does fill a big niche. But for, people like me that call themselves web developers first, I'm not sure. But they do have web components, and they do have that JavaScript component model there. So I think they are bridging the gap a little so you can do both.
Okay, very, very cool. We had another question around the area around, this is from Ian, saying, if you use the JWT framework that fixes the alg none issue, then what do you think of it? Like that issue aside.
Well, I mean, we use it on Okta, right? And we've tried to be like, hey, can we switch to Pasettos? And what we run into a lot is just the legacy code, right? And the people that have been using it one way for 10 years. And so I think, even if you had a new framework or a new standard, you still have to support all these customers that don't want to upgrade. And so I think, JWT itself, like it's such a buzzword, right? Like you won't see many like articles from us praising JWT because we've learned that people are abusing it a lot. And so that's why we downplay it a bit. But for us to influence our company, to have that same like standpoint, been terribly difficult. It's like telling them to get rid of SAML, right? They're like, well, everyone uses SAML. And we're like, no, OIDC is so much better. And the only way I've had success in explaining that concept to developers is like, well, using SAML these days is like using SOAP instead of REST. Right. And then people go like, oh, yeah, I wouldn't use SOAP. Right. That's from 2005. And you're like, so is SAML. Why are you still using it?
Right. Okay. So that's a fairly nuanced perspective on it then. That's great to hear.
But there's also, so OpenID Connect is a thin layer on top of OAuth, and it does the authentication part. OAuth doesn't have anything to do with authentication, just authorization. And so that standardizes on JWT for that ID token that comes back. And so there hasn't been as many issues there because it's just identification information, right? So they typically try to make them thin and fast. And it's the access tokens where people are trying to put, session information or things like that to keep that state. And so that's just the abuse we've seen. And that's why we downplay it. But we're not really against the technology. We're just like, people abuse it a lot.
Yeah. That makes total sense. One of the other criticisms I frequently hear about it is the issue of revoking tokens. Given that it's out there, it's already made, it's difficult to revoke them in the event that you have a breach or some other issue, which is maybe not the case with some of the other methods. Have you seen that to be the case as well, or do you buy that argument?
Well, it can be a problem. And so what we recommend in that situation is that you have your access token be very short-lived, like maybe even a minute or 2 minutes or 5 at most, but none of this like 24 hours or 48 hours or a year. And a lot of the people that use OAuth and OpenID Connect, Google and Facebook are two great examples, have done it wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Facebook had an issue where you could impersonate someone else and then see all their stuff and manipulate that. And that was because what Facebook was doing was giving you that person's access token, right? And it was good for 72 hours or 3 weeks or something like that. And so what is generally recommended is the access token is very short-lived, but then you have a refresh token that can always get a new access token, right? So that refresh token can be years long, but all it does is allow you to talk to the authorization server and get a new access token. And so I think that's the pattern we recommend, but it can be difficult to like get used to that. And then if you're doing everything on the server side and using like Spring Security, and you're storing your access tokens and your refresh tokens in the session, and your session expires, and refresh token doesn't do you any good because it's gone. Right. So that's a problem that I'm trying to think of this year, and what's a good solution for it, right? Can Spring Security store your refresh token somewhere else and somehow associate your old session ID to it and then give you an access token in a session? Like it's kind of a problem that comes up when you try to do, the stateful architecture that's the most secure, but you still want to use refresh tokens and your client doesn't do the auth. So yeah.
Very complex problem.
Right.
But it keeps you busy at Okta, it sounds like.
Oh yeah.
We had another question going back to the topic of React here. So this one's from Austin Hall. It says, we're investigating incorporating TypeScript into our React applications. When have you seen the transition to TypeScript succeed and fail? That's a great question.
So I was an early adopter of TypeScript, mostly because of Angular. I don't know if you remember when Angular 2 was first announced, they had a thing called @script. And it was like this new language that they were using. And it looked similar to TypeScript and it had annotations just like we have in Java. And then after a while, they just adopted TypeScript, right, from Microsoft. And that, I think, was one of the big drivers of the popularity of, TypeScript was just Angular, making people use it by default. And I think Venkat's the only one that I ever saw like do an Angular 2 app with JavaScript. And it wasn't like intuitive. He's just a smart guy and figured it out, right? And so, So I think, for me as a Java developer, like TypeScript made sense right away. And it wasn't very difficult to like figure it out. But for people that aren't used to like typed languages, I've seen this from like PHP folks or pure JavaScript folks, like TypeScript is like, it angers them, right? They're like, why? Like it works so nice just to have JavaScript that's so like malleable and I can do so much with it and I don't have to worry about types. And I think what I've seen a lot is that when you scale a development team, like it's nice to have those types, whether it's, doing a backend in PHP or Java. Like the big companies tend to use Java for two reasons. One, because the typing allows them to refactor things, very easily on a large code base, but also because there's more Java developers than any other developers. So I've seen companies switch from one language to another just because they can't hire any more experts. Like there aren't any, right? And so they're like, well, we got to go Java, darn it.
Yeah, fair enough. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the TypeScript protocol doesn't require that you do a full transition, right? You can piecemeal it along the way.
Right. There's different ways of saying like strict typing versus less strict typing, and there's an any keyword that's similar to object in Java, right? You can just have it be an any. You lose some of the abilities, right, and the nice things they have for refactoring, but yeah, I mean you can easily take a JavaScript file and rename it to .ts, and it should work. Right. And so, that's the idea is you can have those types. And then, it's like erasures with annotations that we have in Java. Once you compile it to JavaScript, like all that's gone. Right. And so it's really helping you build that code base and maybe doesn't affect, so much the runtime behavior.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that you see the negative sides mostly the developer facing in terms of their experience for those who are maybe not used to strictly typed languages? Or have you actually seen failure cases where there was a systemic problem and they actually, got themselves into a really sticky situation?
More of the former. I think it's preference. I've seen a lot of success stories where people migrated a large code base to TypeScript and then they were happy about it. But I think some of those can be biased because as developers, we love learning a new language. And when we feel like we've got some sort of mastery of it, we're like, yes, right? I'm more marketable. I can get more money, right? So I think, those success stories can be biased in that way where, they started out hating it and then they grew to love it and then they become masters of it and they were like, oh, this is really cool.
Very true. We have to watch out for our biases. Excellent question. Great to hear that response. Let's see. That's the last one on that area. Let's see. We got some really good questions.
But to follow up with that, just with the TypeScript and React, and I've seen this with Vue as well. When I first started Okta, I started writing tutorials with React and Vue, and I was using TypeScript with those just because I wanted to, and there wasn't that many TypeScript tutorials out there. And it was difficult. Like there wasn't that much information because not a lot of people are doing it. Fast forward 5 years, and there's a lot more being done to allow TypeScript as an option from the get-go. and even Vue 3, which is going to be like the default version of Vue in the next month, rewrote everything in TypeScript. So even them as staunch like JavaScript people were like, this is going to make it easier to scale and grow.
Right. That's especially interesting because Vue is one of the most bare bones of the 3 major frameworks, right?
Right. And so it doesn't require that you use TypeScript, right? It just means that their framework is written in it. And we have a similar experience at Okta. We have an Auth.js project that's the baseline for all of our Vue and Angular and React SDKs. And I was one of the first ones, right? When I started in the first 6 months, I was like, we need TypeScript versions of these. And it took like 3 or 4 years till they did it. Mm-hmm. And when they did it, instead of like writing the types, they just rewrote it in TypeScript. And so I think that's like the easier, harder, right? It's easy and hard, but once you've done it, you don't have to maintain like a separate list of types, right, for your application because your application has them in there.
Those .d, .ts type files, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, fun hunting those down. I'm sure that's been a pain for many developers.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like the situation's gotten much better. So if anyone's maybe thinking about dipping their toes into it, you'd say give them the go ahead?
Yeah, I think one of the things you really need to experience, so I just got back from working remotely in Cabo San Lucas the last couple of weeks, and the slow internet thing is, I think every developer should experience that because it's really eye-opening. And I think like more than half of the world, or maybe 75% of the world, experiences that every day, right? And so it's back to like the mobile first thing that, we need to be testing like mobile apps on a 3G connection, not on a 5G connection. And, we need to like do performance testing and, regression testing on our performance of our apps, just because, there are people out there, and it's most of the world, if you really want to target the general public, that, the fat client might not work well for them. And that's why PWAs were kind of invented, is because there was phones sold in like India that couldn't even fit the Facebook app on it. They didn't have enough memory. Right. Wow. And so Facebook was like, well, if we want to reach those people, we need to develop something that's browser based and still acts like a mobile app.
Yep, absolutely fair. Thinking back to that, those days is kind of wild to think about. Kind of stepping back for a second, tying both back end and front end together. We're curious if you have any top tips or things that come to mind when integrating front end code, calling microservices, and how people approach that, both from like a dev perspective or even from a production perspective.
Yeah, so I think there's several ways to do it. You're not going to have anything session based, right? Because your microservices are distributed. You could have a JWT based architecture where you're generating the JWTs. You're not using an external provider. You're sending those JWTs and it's doing the validation there. Or you can use OAuth and OpenID Connect. That's my recommendation, because then you're sending those access tokens between the microservices, and they're able to validate them, and it's stateless in that way, because you're trying to have a stateless architecture when you're doing, that sort of thing. So I think, that's one of the best ways. I do still see with microservices a fair amount of basic authentication still being used. And I think that's okay behind the firewall. But try to use HTTPS, even if you're using basic, because, the biggest threat that most people have is people inside their company, right? Or people impersonating people inside their company. So, if one administrator gets compromised, then they have access to servers that they can, change things or create new users for themselves. Like, that's the biggest danger. So HTTPS, a lot of people are like, well, I don't need it for my site because I don't have anything secure on it. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is if you're in a hotel and you access a site over HTTP, that hotel can inject like JavaScript into it and serve you ads, right? So it's more of the origin than it is the destination that you're trying to get to. So HTTPS makes it so no one can see or modify that data, versus HTTP, like anyone could.
Right. Such good points. It does bring the question to mind. There's been some controversy or some talk recently about the broad adoption of Let's Encrypt and generating certificates, and who should we trust for generating certificates. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Well, I think there's some stat out there I got from InfoQ a couple of years ago about Let's Encrypt, like increasing the usage of HTTPS by like 60% across the internet, right? So that's huge. And what I really love about Let's Encrypt is they have automated APIs. First, they have APIs that you can use to get a new certificate. And they also don't have like long-lived certificates. So you typically have to use them. You have to set up some sort of automation to get a new certificate, maybe every 90 or 180 days or whatnot. But expired certificates is like something that happens to companies all the time, and they just forget about, right? And it's from the days when we used to buy SSL certificates that cost thousands of dollars, especially if you wanted a wildcard one. And that company was just the certificate authority, and because they had a name, you trusted them. And I think Let's Encrypt has really made it so a provider like us can give you a custom domain and map your login page to it, and we can generate that certificate for it and set up everything for you in a couple of minutes. Heroku does this as well. Anyone that like allows automatic provisioning of an SSL endpoint is probably using Let's Encrypt. And before that, like you have to actually like download a certificate, upload it, hope you got everything right, and then hope it works, right? And so I think from a developer experience standpoint, Let's Encrypt is one of the best things that happened to the internet.
All right, excellent. Thanks for that well-rounded perspective on that. We have another question that came in during that, and this actually relates to one I was just about to ask you. So I was going to ask you, what's the secret to writing maintainable code? Austin Hawes has a more specific framing here. He says, JavaScript's applications dependencies age so quickly. I think that we can all agree with that. What practices and tools help you keep on top of it, install and test dependency upgrades?
So when I first started working at Okta, we would write our front end, SPA like tutorials with just like npm install Angular, right, or npm install React or whatever, and we never specified version numbers. And it only took like 6 months or so before we started getting comments like this doesn't work, right? And so we're like, oh yeah, we need to specify version numbers, right? And then npm maintainers or JavaScript maintainers, and this probably happens in Java just as much, but in Java, like there's no recommended practice to use ranges on your dependencies. Like Maven and Gradle support it, but no one does it. Versus npm is like ranges by default, right? And what happens is developers break shit all the time, like just doing a very patch release, right? It's not even a Maya release, it's a patch release. It breaks something and then it doesn't work anymore, and you don't know why, because everything worked yesterday. And it's because you got an upgrade in there. And, that's why they invented like the package lock file, right? So it would lock the dependencies to what it was built yesterday and it wouldn't upgrade it. And it's just one of those things that I've learned that don't use ranges, right? With NPM and JHipster, we don't use ranges. Like we use Dependabot and we get like 50 Dependabot updates a day for the JavaScript dependencies. So there is one guy, Daniel Franco, that like he deserves a medal because he merges all those. And it just runs like an hour's worth of integration tests that prove that didn't break anything. So, with all of NPM stuff, it's always integration tests. It's always specifying that exact version. And sometimes that doesn't work too, because developers are savvy, right? They see an NPM install command and they're like, I'm not going to copy the version part because I want to use the next version of React. And you're like, man, I tested this with this version. I know it works. And you're just sabotaging my tutorial, right? And so it's really tough with JavaScript developers in particular to kind of get that across. I think Java developers, when they see a version, they just use it. They don't try to upgrade, and maybe they know that that's a thing that could bite them if they do. And so, the biggest thing we do now is we try to specify those versions. We make sure in QA every post, like run actually through the code before we publish it. And then we just watch for comments where people are like, hey, this doesn't work anymore. And we're like, did you use the version specified here? And we started doing GitHub repos for everything. So, maybe it doesn't work with the instructions there, but I guarantee if you clone that repo and use that one, like it'll work, right? And so it's even a problem that we've seen with Spring Boot. So Spring Boot, start.spring.io, if you create a new app on start.spring.io, it works for basically 2 years or maybe 18 months. And then that version isn't available. So if you never specify a version, then it'll work forever, but that's dangerous too, right? Like things might break or things might go away. So Spring like deprecates the versions on start.spring.io. Like they'll still be available in Maven Central, but you couldn't create like a Spring Boot 2.1 app today to start.spring.io. It's not an option. And so they like to think of it as a best practice, right? To not specify a version. And we're like, man, we've been bitten so much by NPM that we have to. So,
oh yeah, that is some fantastic advice. what calls to mind, I mean, is just the scenario that unfolded a few weeks ago, where an open source developer made some breaking changes to prove a point, and there were countless organizations that were bricked because of that. The policies that you just described would have protected any of them from that problem, right?
Right. But if you're using a Dependabot or something like Sneak or JFrog, they all have this way of updating your dependencies, right? It's really about your unit tests, right, and your integration tests. Are you testing enough to catch when there's an issue like that, right? Like you might just assume the fake data is there from faker.js, and it's not there anymore, or it prevents the startup of your app, but you never saw it with your tests. And so that's why tests are so important. And still, they won't catch everything, right? So every once in a while, with JHipster, like, you have to manually create an app and like try to reproduce the problem that way. But another thing I've learned is so we have a number of NPM projects that I support that have NPM dependency updates coming in, right? And there can be like, let's say 10 a week. And so for a while there, I was spending my Monday mornings going in, and there was 5 sample projects that need to be updated. So I'd spend the time to merge the Dependabots, and then I'd pull down the projects and test them all and stuff like that. And what I learned is, just wait for a release. Like there's no reason to be merging these dependencies all the time every week if there's not a release, right? Like wait until that part of your life where you're like, I'm going to do a release. Now I'll start merging the updates, right? Instead of like, merging updates to the main branch when it's not going to be used for another month or two, right? And so Dependabot will close old ones, open new ones and stuff like that. And you can kind of ease the burden on yourself. But with something like JHipster that has, hundreds of dependencies across the various frameworks, I think it does make sense to catch those sooner. And we have a much bigger team than, the small projects that I'm supporting.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, great points. We got a couple more new questions coming in here. Excellent. So let's see. Richard Hall is asking, if you were trying to pick up a new language or technology, where would you go to gain knowledge and practice if your work doesn't use the language or technology?
So I've experienced this my whole life because before Okta, I was an independent consultant. And so rarely did I get to work with the fun languages and technology, right? I was hired to solve this problem or increase this performance or help with an architecture, but I never got to choose the technologies. They were always chosen when I got there, or maybe they hired me. A lot of times as an independent consultant, it's funny how many times people will hire you to tell them what they already know, right? And it always took me like a week or two to realize like, they're actually just going to tell me what they want me to tell them back, right? But as an expert, like my opinion is valued more for their superiors than it is for them, right? And so they're just trying to get their point across, and that's why they're willing to pay the big bucks, is to push their agenda along, right? And so that's always been funny. But open source has been the biggest outlet for me. Back in the day, I created AppFuse as a way of like fusing together, struts and Hibernate on the back end without EJBs. And I was doing it with Xdoclet at the time, right? And then along came like Spring and made it so you didn't need any of that. And it just simplified things a fair amount. And so I had a ton of fun with like creating AppFuse and building the community and like learning all about Java. And I did a ton of learning in the open, right? I think it's tougher to do as you get older, but I think you should do it anyway. And that's, being vulnerable online and like learning in the open and saying, hey, I can't figure this out, anyone's idea. And you can do that on Stack Overflow a little easier than you can your own blog. But like if it tripped you up at one point, once you figured it out from Stack Overflow, like write a blog post about it just to show like, here's the trouble I was experiencing and here's how I solved it. And I think that's really a great way to learn. So using open source. Also, if you're a visual learner, there's things like egghead.io that has, nice compact videos on a topic. I've used Pluralsight before. They have longer form videos. That works well as well. And my biggest advice is like, I'm the type of person that if I grabbed a book, let's say I didn't know Kotlin, right? And I grabbed a book on Kotlin and I read it, like I'm going to get to the end of that book and be like, I still don't know Kotlin, right? Like I read a lot of code, but I didn't learn anything, right? And so maybe I'll try a smaller book or something that's like an intro to Kotlin or just a tutorial online. And then I'll go and actually try to write some code or build an app. Maybe it's one I've built before with a different language, but I want to try it with Kotlin. And then I'll come back to that book and read it again. And like so much more things will make sense, right? Like I still read Spring Boot books because there's things that I might have missed, right? But as an experienced Spring Boot developer, like it's easy for me to read it knowing the things I know already.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points there. I'll take those to heart. I had that exact same experience with Scala, diving into the books, which was the most obtuse book I ever read, and then later became one of the most essential handbooks that I could ever have. So,
Yeah.
We've got another great question here. Going back to the vulnerability aspects of things a little bit, Mark Smith is asking, what are your thoughts on the Log4j vulnerability, and what are your recommendations for minimizing exposure to issues like that? Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, that was one of those things that you never even saw like coming, right? Like you could send this sort of payload to a random endpoint and it would end up in the logs and then it would exploit things, right? So I actually, on my personal blog, I escaped that because I haven't upgraded Apache Roller, which runs it in like years, right? And so it's still using Log4j1. And I just ignored the problem for several days when it first happened because I was like, it's not really my problem. It's my hosting provider's problem, right? Like their server is going to be compromised. So they should be the one like fixing things, right? Not me and my apps. And so when I finally did went and look at it, it's like, a 1.x version of Log4j. So I was like, sweet, it's not in there. But I think, a lot of it's, we have a talk upcoming at RJUG next month that hasn't been posted on Meetup yet, but it's reporting vulnerabilities, right? And there's people out there that do a fair amount of like, testing and trying to break stuff. They're often called, I think, white hat testers, but that's probably a bad name for them, right? Like white hat and black hat. We probably need, different names for
There's
them these days.
Red team, blue team is the other. Yeah.
Is that the new terms for them?
Well, at least in some contexts. But yeah.
Yeah. It's knowing what's out there, right? So a lot of times with Dependabot, Dependabot's free on GitHub repos. I'm not sure about like GitLab or other ones. But it's free, so it's very limited. It's not going to do a whole lot, but things like JFrog's X-Ray or Sneak, right? They might be more on top of vulnerabilities that have been reported. But one of the big problems with reporting of vulnerabilities is like 10% of them actually get reported, right? And so open source projects are probably better about it than most. But I think when they happen, like who's ever developing it tries to cover it up instead of telling everyone, right? And so that can certainly be a problem. And I think, those resources, those reporting mechanisms, I think hopefully will be used more. And then you need to have automated ways of getting those notifications, right, that something is vulnerable. And we've been, creating repositories for our blog posts for the last 4 years. And we do get like Dependabot updates for a security vulnerability of an NPM dependency. And in my mind, I'm like, well, it doesn't really matter because if they use the versions, they'll get, the right thing, but they never use the versions, right? So they might get the vulnerable one. So we go ahead and merge those, even though it doesn't really match the blog post, because if someone did clone that repo, you want them to not have that vulnerability in there. But I think it's a global problem. I mean, one of my coworkers, Brian Demers, did a little bit of listening in on the White House thing that happened recently, right? And that was like Apache committers that worked on Log4j and the Apache organization and people from like Google and IBM and everything coming to the White House because the White House was like, what the heck, right? This shouldn't have happened, right? How can we prevent it from happening again? And I think somewhat of the conclusion was education. And if you think about it,
Sure.
like I don't have a computer science background, right? But I know that people that do never get taught security, right? And they never get taught things about reporting vulnerabilities or where to look if a library has a vulnerability and stuff like that. So I think that's hopefully what comes out of it is better education for programmers in general about security. And I've been wondering for the longest time, like, when is IntelliJ going to tell me that I'm doing it wrong, right? When are they going to be the ones that's like, hey, you have a plain text password here, you shouldn't do that, right? Or you're storing a secret in a properties file, you shouldn't do that. And I think Sneak is onto something here where in the last 6 months or maybe the last year, they are developing like IDE plugins that'll do things like that, right? And alert you as a developer that you shouldn't be doing this because it could cause issues.
Yeah, this is sort of the outgrowth of DevOps into DevSecOps, right? Where we're getting that real-time feedback on our approach.
right? And I think I hate that name, DevSecOps.
Yeah,
It's someone coming up with a new marketing term. It's really DevOps, right? Like
yep.
adding SecOps in there is should have never had to happen, right? But it does because people aren't always aware of the security situations, right? And we as developers are lazy, right? So if the framework doesn't do it for us, we kind of just ignore that part.
Yeah, so true. So you heard it, folks. Education and automation are two of our biggest strengths there for dealing with those issues. I don't know about you personally, but a lot of the colleagues I talked to found out about that particular vulnerability through various RSS feeds and Hacker News, not through any type of automated system. So,
Well, it's funny. I even got like a question from my dad, right? What about, are you dealing with Log4Shell? And at the time, it was only like a day, and I was like, do you mean Log4j issue? Like I even had the terminology right and he or wrong, and he had it right because he had seen it like on CNN or something like that, right? Like it made massive news. And I think, there's a great XKCD article on it where it's like, this little thing that holds up the internet is like something like Log4j that 6 people work on, right?
yeah, if you have that or anyone has that XKCD link, please do share it for the rest of us in the channel. There's a question that's in here. Oh, actually, we got a new one. I'll hold off on that one. Do the audience question first here. Let's see. We got Austin again. We got, what is your feel for the whole REST versus GraphQL? Have you seen success using one more than the other? Another great question.
Yeah, so I think GraphQL is definitely one of those things that people like it when they've used it. If they haven't used it, they're probably resistant to it, and they're like, that sounds like something that REST should solve, right? And even when I worked back at LinkedIn way back in the day, 2007 and 8, they had a way of specifying like on their APIs like a full object or a partial object, right? So they were actually writing code with different endpoints to like give back certain fields, right? And I think at that time it was either all or a thin version, right? And so what GraphQL really gives you is the ability on the client to say what you want. And so if you're not writing different clients for your API, you probably don't experience that problem. But if you're writing different clients that have different data, then you might have a whole different problem. And you're like, if you're experiencing that writing multiple things to give back different views of your data, GraphQL will solve that problem for you. And there's nothing in GraphQL that says you can't have REST APIs in that same app, right? I think it's not an all or nothing thing, but it is one of those things that hasn't been adopted much by the Java community, at least officially. Like only in the last year did Spring take one of the most popular Java projects that integrated GraphQL in Spring and said, okay, you can join Spring Data. We'll make an official Spring Data GraphQL project. And that still hasn't gone 1.0, but I think it's close. And that's really like, it's funny because Josh Long was one of those people that was kind of like, you don't need GraphQL, right? And now he's like over the moon about it, right? He's like, GraphQL is the best. And so again, I think if you've played with it and you've seen the benefit, you probably like it. If you haven't, then you haven't seen the light. And you might not need it.
That's a great.
You have to realize it was invented by Facebook, right? And showing the graph of data, and they might have different, views of that data. And so it succeeded in that way. And I think, JHipster, I created an issue several years ago that was like, we should add it to JHipster. And it's kind of been open and closed over the years. But now that I think there's a Spring Data one, like it might get a little more momentum. And it shouldn't be hard because Spring typically makes things pretty easy to integrate.
Yeah. So there's two pieces of that I want to follow up on. The first piece of it was, it sounds like there's sort of a litmus test there. Then if you're feeling a pain point, then maybe it's worth checking out. And if you're not, then maybe spend your time and attention in an area where you are seeing a pain point.
Right. Yeah. Just be pragmatic, right? Don't like say we have to use GraphQL because I haven't learned it yet and I need a new resume item, right? Like,
right. Yeah. Resume-driven development. That's right. The second follow-up I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned Josh Long, who had a opinion switch, and there was a lot of curiosity, in particular for you. Is there anything that you've changed your mind about strongly over the years? Where you used to be on one camp, and now somehow you're looking back and you're on the other side.
That's a good one. I don't know. I think, one of the benefits of working at Okta is I've never had to be strongly opinionated about one technology. One of the things that Josh has done really well is he's never bashed another technology, right? So if you were to ask him about like, Spring Boot versus Micronaut and Quarkus, he would probably be like, they all work well, right? Like he's very good about that. And I'm similar in that I don't like to bash any technologies because chances are people worked hard to bring that one to light and make a product out of it. But I have been very privileged in the sense of I get to work with all kinds of different technologies, right? And I don't have to be like a Spring Boot, like pushing Spring Boot all the time, right? I can talk about Quarkus and its benefits as well. And so that's probably been the biggest thing is I'm not against any technology because if I can add authentication to it, then I'm interested, right?
Well, that's a really great lead into another topic we were really curious about, which is what does your personal learning process look like? You've been developing for decades now. You're got your hands in a lot of different tools, technologies. What sort of approaches have you developed that help you to really get up to speed quickly and feel like you're learning at a pace that you're comfortable with?
Yeah, a lot of times it's writing code, right? Coming up with some sort of simple example that I can write code and show like a concept with, even to myself, right? And so the one that I've worked on a lot in 2021 was Spring Native, and Spring Native came out like a year and a half ago, and I had fits with it trying to make it work, and it wasn't until Spring Security came along that I was like, okay, now that works, I can go and like write a tutorial about it and put it on our blog or whatever. But the real challenge came when I tried to integrate it into JHipster. Right. There's one thing about having like a simple app that's got a simple endpoint that, requires authentication. It's another thing to have something like JHipster, which has, the full gamut of the front end code. It has things like Liquidbase that creates your tables and populates your database. It's got, tests that do a certain thing. It's got reflection just because it was convenient. And sitting with Josh and figuring that part out was really like difficult, but very rewarding. And so what I did was I flew out to San Francisco in September, and Josh and I basically just, eliminated all distractions. And how we did that was I shared my screen on his TV, so I couldn't do anything else because he would be like, "Hey, get back to the thing," right? And so it's a lot of the concepts of pair programming in that, if you need to solve a problem and you have, two semi-experts on it, like sitting together and actually spending the time to do it can really work. And even when Josh and I did it again in November, we did it virtually. We didn't fly that time, but we did it on Zoom, and we still spent like 4 or 5, 6 hours one day, like figuring out the new bits because Spring Security was, or Spring Boot was up to 2.6, and we had to change some things. So, that's a great way if you need to learn something quickly and you're trying to solve a problem. But if you're on your own, you're learning a new language or something like that, try to find like a simple tutorial or even a YouTube video, because YouTube is really, the place for a lot of tutorials nowadays. And some people are visual learners, and then try to write that code and then come up with your own app, write that code, and then read more, right? Once you've actually learned some of the concepts. That's how I've done it.
Fantastic advice for us to follow. And towards some of that you mentioned, the value of pair programming and learning from and with others. Sort of shifting away from the technical side a little bit, do you have any pro tips for people to improve their soft skills to help those one-on-one personal interactions flow better, to get quicker organizational change, or any of those areas?
Yeah, so I do want to mention about the pair programming thing because I like it in bursts. I don't like it all the time. I think it's very difficult to like do it on a daily basis because, especially with COVID times, like we're starting to enjoy our privacy even more, right? And to have to sit with someone on Zoom all day, you're like, this is exhausting, right? I'll just go get a new job. And so that's my perspective on pair programming. And what was the
yeah. So on a broader level, just any tips on how programmers can improve their soft skills?
Right. So people skills and ability to communicate with others. So I do that pretty well in person. I think at conferences, like I typically have a lot more humor when I'm talking, and even here with you, there's more humor than if I was doing a screencast. Like I recorded 4 screencasts in December, and we're just starting to publish them in the next couple of weeks, and there's like one or two of them that I'm like, you don't even seem happy to be here, Matt. Right. But then like the J hipster one, I'm like, wee, and I'm, happy and I'm smiling and stuff like that. So I've noticed if I'm in front of an audience, like I will be more like that. And if I know the technology well, but if it's something that, I've just learned, or maybe I don't know it that well to talk about it, like I'm kind of shut down a little. So I encourage people to try public speaking, but in person, right? Like wait for that. Like maybe do a little practice, or see if your company has a Toastmasters, or maybe a local, user group has a Toastmasters or whatever. But don't expect like to develop those skills that much in these times. I think, just the people interaction really helps those skills evolve. And especially when you see others, right, with those skills, that's when you learn like, man, Josh is funny, right? I need more jokes in my talks, because when Josh tells jokes, like they're funny. And then you're like, he tells that same joke like every time and people laugh. And then you've seen people that have seen it 10 times, including yourself. And you're like, I still can't wait for the punchline, right? So those kind of things, and just seeing other people that you admire and how they do things I think is a good way to like develop those. But like my people skills on Slack are terrible, right? I forget to like ask how your weekend was, and try to be nice to people. I'm more to the point, and a lot of times I'm like, damn, I'm doing it wrong. And I used to work with a guy, James Goodwill, who was from the South, so I think that helped a lot with his people skills. He was just very kind, and he would spend an hour with you on Monday morning just talking about the weekend, right? And there was times in my life where I was like, man, Jim, I just want to get some work done, right? Stop talking. But like in hindsight, everyone he worked with loved him, including me, right? And so like that's one thing to consider, is it's not always about work, right? Try to like develop relationships with people, and ask about their kids or their dog or their weekend, or what kind of car they like or something like that. Just try to be nice, be kind.
That's fantastic advice. It's one of the reasons we're really, really looking forward to bringing UJUG back into person when COVID is finally under control, and get those human interactions back. We've got Brian Dowdy here saying, shout out for Toastmasters. So we have some local meetups people can take advantage of if they're looking to try that out. Great.
Yeah, my wife works for a company here in Denver that has a Toastmasters group. I think they meet like every Thursday, or maybe just once a month on a Thursday. And it's funny because she does like I do, where she has presentations, and it'll be more of a group presentation where she talks for maybe 10 or 15 minutes during it. But when she started this job a couple of years ago, like the whole presenting was kind of new to her, right? And the Toastmasters, it's been so neat to see her joy like doing the Toastmasters. And like she'll dress up, they'll have like different themes, and she'll just be in her office like with a weird hat on and sunglasses and stuff. So I think it's a lot more fun than typical presentations. So even at Okta we don't have one, but they're looking at starting one, and I was like, yeah, I want to do it. That'd be fun.
Yeah, it sounds like fun is a really key ingredient to making it something that you're going to give your all to, and people are going to engage in.
Well, and that's what you learn from Toastmasters. I went to they had a World Series or World Championship here in Denver at the Gaylord out by the airport of Toastmasters. And so as I asked my boss at the time, I was like, hey, can I go to this? I want to see what's going on. And he let me, and it's all about stories, right? And so the people that when they had like, this final round or whatever, there was 5 people, and they started with telling a story, and then they would impersonate the voices of the different characters. And that was like the whole thing, right? It was character development of the story. And so I think, that's what really relates to people when you're talking with them. And you'll notice that many of the great speeches of our time, before technology entered the picture, like people memorized them, right? And they never had a presentation. And so a lot of it's about stories. And if you can relate anything you're talking about technology-wise to a story, then people really identify with that and really love your talk, right? Because they're like, wow, I could relate to that story.
Yeah, already I'm thinking back to you talking about your father getting the log4shell accurately, and yeah, it sticks up there. Absolutely. We got another question that came in here from Manaj. I hope I'm saying that correctly. What are your recommendations on project estimation and how to avoid underestimation or overestimation?
Yeah, when
That's a tough
that's
one.
the hard one. They're really just wild ass guesses, right? Like you don't know. I think if you've done it a few times, maybe you know, but it's really tough to like estimate like how long it'll take to do something. So typically what I've done is I break it down into smaller chunks, right? So it's easier to understand. And then whatever estimate I have in my mind, I double or triple it because chances are I think I can get a lot done faster than I can because there's so many distractions during the day and there's so many interruptions, there's so many meetings, right? That can really throw things off. So I think if you want to match like how long you think it'll take you to get something done, you really need to like kill Slack, kill your email, have no distractions or be pair programming with someone. And then you might get to that state. But that's like the kind of work that is only fun when you're in the flow state, and the rest of the time you're like, this job is just it's a lot of work, right? And so I think that's the key is doubling or tripling or quadrupling your estimates because of all the little things that like get in the way and suck your time, and it's not you writing code.
Yeah, great tip. 2x it, 3x it if you need to. So it sounds like if I can just to reframe that, it sounds like overestimation is less of a problem in your mind than underestimation.
Yeah, because a lot of times you can break it down to like a day or two as far as the task is concerned, and then it's easy to estimate that, right? But if you're talking about this whole feature, right, that requires a backend or database changes or things like that, like you might be depending on other people. If you're doing microservices right, like all those people are on your team and you can collaborate with them to deliver the feature. But a lot of companies still don't work that way. So you might have to talk to a different department or a different group to actually get those changes in there. So you might be waiting for a day before you can even do something that you're trying to implement, right? That's why if you can break it down into non-sequential things, you can maybe shift to something else while you're waiting for someone to, deliver on that other one.
Excellent. That sounds a little bit like a personal like productivity hack. Do you have any more in your back pocket that you could share with us?
So the biggest one is shutting shit down, right? Like Slack and email, which is hard because it's kind of fun to get notifications and new messages or, new things on Twitter and stuff like that. So it's almost like, you know, me as a programmer, I think if they had ADHD diagnosis when I was a kid, I probably would have got it and I might be on meds now, right? But yeah, it's really hard to like be okay, I'm gonna work on this, right? And so
Yeah.
I think you have to almost get in that state of mind. And if you're not in that state of mind, work on something else, right? Like plan those things when you're in a good mood. I've also seen that maybe it's because I'm getting older or whatever, and I got a new sleep number bed over there. But man, if I get 8 or 9 hours of sleep, I am a new person, right? I feel a lot better. I feel like it's a Friday, right? And stuff like that. So I think rest is really important for productivity. I've also seen a lot of success in planning for 6 months. So I started it several years ago, not 6 months, 6 weeks. So I do like a 6 week plan where I'm like, in the next 6 weeks, here's the things I want to accomplish. And I usually do like 3 or 4 items a week. As a developer advocate, it might be like start this example app. I've stopped putting like finish or write an example app. I've started putting start for the most part because chances are once you start, like you care about it and you'll come back to it, right? You don't need to remind yourself to keep working on it. And so starting is one of the most important things. And then I also try to have like 1 or 2 major items a week. And I think you can be most productive if you have one. So instead of focusing on 6 different things in a week, just have like one theme that you're trying to accomplish in that week. And we all try to get so much done all the time. And I think if we just concentrate on 1 or 2 things, we might have better success and a better work-life balance where we're like, this week wasn't so bad. Like you don't want those weeks when you really feel proud to be the ones that you worked 50 hours, right? You want it to be the ones where you're like, I only worked 25 and I got a shit ton done.
Feel great about it.
Right.
Yeah. That is some fantastic advice. I'm curious. I've heard in the past there's a lot of people who are at companies who are shifting almost entirely to Slack, especially now we're in this post-pandemic COVID world where everyone's remote. And how do you deal with the pressures to always stay connected to all the channels and actually, sever that line? How can you close out in a way that doesn't, isolate you from that company culture or from connections that maybe are important?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm doing it right because, well, I'm isolated from like, I don't have to be connected. In fact, I could go for probably days and not be connected and not put something in Slack, and my coworkers would just know that I'm working on something. Um, but a lot of that's because I'm not responsible for really anything. I'm not in a production capacity, right? My production is publishing a blog post, right? And once it's published, like it's good to go as long as there's no comments that come in and say I did it wrong, right? Or I find an error later. So it's much easier to be in that capacity and not be like, hey, we need this fixed, or hey, your code broke something, right? Or this test is failing, can you fix it, right? I think that's why a lot of us try to stay connected all the time, is because we feel like it might be our fault and we should be able to fix it like quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't want to look bad, right? And in COVID times, like I think the trust is often built on how fast you respond to things that concern you, right? And that's a terrible model, but it's kind of what we're stuck with. And so I think like having some sort of agreement with your team that you can go dark, right, for a day or two to get stuff done is a good idea. And saying like, feel free to text me, right, or DM me, and I'll get an alert for that. But I'm gonna actually go and try to get some stuff done, and that works for those of us that can actually be creative and go offline to get stuff done. I think it might be hard for like DevOps people or people that are monitoring like things on a day-to-day basis. I don't know what you do for them.
Sure.
Like, check it. I mean, one technique I've heard from, I think it was a 4-hour work week, was like only check your email twice a day, like at 11 and at 5. And that's it. And that's hard too. But I've seen great success with that. Like if I start the day, like I've had, my coffee, a nice breakfast or whatever, and I settle down to do some work and I have an immediate task that I'm interested in and I start working on it, like at 1:00 in the afternoon, I'll be like, I'm just so productive today. And then I open my email and then the day's gone, right? So
Yeah.
like not checking your email can have great rewards. And I've even had days where like email was broken, right? And even though I'm checking it all the time, like Google was down or something like that, so I'm not getting my Gmail. And at the end of the day, I'll be like, Trish, today was so good. And then I'll find out that I have 400 unread emails that just came in, right? And it's like, oh, that's why.
Right. Have you ever found yourself missing anything important when you disconnect like that you regretted?
Nope.
Okay.
I think like work-wise, I always try to, like, my profile has my mobile number in there and people can text me or call me, right? So it's like, if you really need to get in touch with me, then you can. But I almost view it like vacation, where people try to not contact you, right? Yeah. They're like, we're going to do our best not to contact him. He'll be back on Wednesday and then we can worry about it then. But I'm just like everyone else in that, on probably, if I go on a bike ride and it's the middle of the day, I'll probably stop halfway through and like check Slack or check email to see if I missed anything, But I also try to have days where I shut things down, right? I shut the communications down and I just be productive. And then I have days where I don't plan on getting anything done, right? Like I'm not going to be productive today because I'm going to do the Slack and the email thing and I'm going to clear out my inbox or whatever. And I'm not going to be mad at the end of the day because I got inbox 0, right? That's an accomplishment. But it is an interesting point because my dad recently brought it up when we were down in Mexico. He said, like, when you're retired, what are you going to do? Right? And I was like, well, I'm going to ski and golf a lot, right? And ride my bike. And he's like, well, I think the part that you're missing is like most of our lives as productive people, we get a certain amount of satisfaction from being productive and accomplishing things, right? So he was like encouraging me to have hobbies. He builds furniture in their basement. He has a wood shop. And so he feels like he gets that, productivity satisfaction from building stuff because you accomplish something in a day versus, people that are retired that don't, build something or have productivity tasks or hobbies might feel unrewarded. And those are the ones that are like, okay, I need a job again.
Yeah. So find some wins, find something that will boost that sense of
or find things that you can progress on a daily basis, right? And maybe start now, right? Instead of waiting until we're retired. Like I took some guitar lessons and learned enough to like play a couple songs, like 5 or 6 years ago. And that's one of the things that's like, I should probably get back to that because I see people that, play music and play guitars and they find a lot of satisfaction from that. And so that could be a good hobby, right? You're learning a new song or whatnot.
Some excellent life advice there as well, not just for your career. We got about 5 minutes left. So anybody who has any questions they want to get in, make sure to submit them now. And we can have Matt actually select from them if we have multiple, since we might not be able to get to the rest of them. And until any of those come in, I think I have one last one here that would be great to finish up with from our end, which is, what are your favorite conferences, blogs, social media accounts, podcasts, anything out there that you like to reference to stay up to date? What are your favorites?
So typically what I do for following people on Twitter is trying to follow the people that maybe are major contributors to a framework that I'm enthusiastic about or using. But this doesn't always work, right? Like sometimes those folks like talk politics the whole time, or they talk about their dog the whole time. If they talk about their dog the whole time, I'll probably follow them more, right? But maybe they don't talk about the framework that much, right? Maybe it's more personal or whatnot. So that's one strategy. Like try to find something that gives you news about that technology that you're working with, right? So it might not be the people that work on it. It might be some other outlet. It might be some blog that talks about it a lot, follow that handle. As far as sites, like I was an editor for InfoQ, so I am slightly biased there, where I think they do a really good job of reporting and trying to not be opinionated. I know this because I tried to be opinionated in many of the pieces I wrote, and they were like, "No, Matt, stop it! You can't have an opinion. You're a news reporter, right?" And so I think that's a good resource. I like what they're doing with. I think they were probably inspired by Baldung. That's a great site for quick and easy tutorials. You'll probably hit it a lot of times if you're searching for how to do stuff with Java. But they do like a Java weekly roundup, right? And post like all the things that they found interesting for the week. And I've noticed that InfoQ started doing that as well. And those are like the ones I click on, right? There's been times when I didn't look at InfoQ for months, and now I find myself going back there because of this like weekly roundup that they're doing. So that might even be some advice for your own company or your own blog to do those kind of things, because they do seem to be popular. I think they're tough too, right? Like Josh does This Week in Spring, but he's automated most of it, and he's never missed a day for like 10 years or something like that. It's every Tuesday. So I think those are good resources, right? This Week in Spring, the InfoQ roundup for Java. I'm not a Reddit fan. As part of my job, they asked me to be, and I ended up I got banned from the Java channel for life. So, I got no interest in going back there, but that was my fault, right?
Back up. This sounds like there's an interesting story there. I think we need to know what happened.
No, it's not interesting at all. So it's basically like we publish blog posts, and what we found is if we publish blog posts and we tweet about it and we put it on LinkedIn, like it gets a bit of traffic. If you put it in the LinkedIn or Facebook groups, it gets a lot of traffic. If you put it on Reddit or Hacker News, it gets so much traffic that like your goals are met for the quarter, right? With that one post. And so that's kind of what we were doing on Reddit. And they warned me about it once, and I kind of brushed them off. They were like, most of your interactions here are promoting like Okta blog posts, and you can't do that, right? And so I think they gave me another month, and then they were like, "That's it, you're gone for life." And my coworkers warned me about it. They were like, spend an hour a day on Reddit. Like we will pay you to do that. You can go and do stuff and post new topics and be interactive with the community and stuff. And I just didn't want to, right? So I was the bad community member that was just doing the self-promotion stuff. So they banned me for good reason, right? Like,
Fair enough.
I don't mind,
yeah.
but I'm also not. I wasn't a Reddit user before that. I'm still not one now. And if you are, more power to you. I don't have any problem with the site, but the self-promotion stuff is always interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we couldn't end the AMA without at least one juicy story. So thanks for offering that up. I'm sure everyone appreciates that. Looks like we don't have any final other questions. So we can wrap it up there. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. This was a wealth of really great perspective. I'm sure everyone here has learned at least a few things and will take away some great ideas for their own career. So thanks again. And we look forward.
It's been a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. And we look forward to seeing you perhaps again in the future. So have a great one. Take care. Thanks.
Cheers.
For everybody else, we are going to give some door prizes now. Oh, sorry about that. We'll bring you back for an encore if you really want. There we go. So just a reminder, we've got Venkat's Agile Learner. That one, we've already done the allotment here. And so Ian Robertson, congratulations on Venkat's Agile Learner. We will email all winners, by the way, so you don't have to say anything in the chat. We've got two $25 tech gift cards. The first one goes to Angelo Kontgas, if I'm saying that right, or Kontgas. And the second one's going to go to Gregory Hendricks. So congrats to both of you. And then we have a number of JetBrains licenses that we need to get out. So if you would like a JetBrains license, just leave a comment on the chat there and we will send you one. We've got that many. So thanks everybody for participating. And we look forward to seeing you in February for Venkat's talk. Thanks, guys. Take care.